He was born with nothing, sold before he could speak, and raised to obey. But one night, he said no, and he said it to the most dangerous man in the empire. This is the story of a boy who dared to defy Emperor Nero, and the punishment that echoed not just through his body, but through the very soul of Rome. Hit subscribe now, because this forgotten chapter of ancient cruelty is something history tried to erase, and you won't believe what happened next. His name was Mikan. At least, that was the name given to him. A Greek word whispered by the trader who sold him on a cracked marble platform beneath the midday sun. He was 10. Small, underfed, but striking in a way that caught attention. Olive-toned skin, dark amber eyes, and hair like burnt honey. He remembered nothing of his mother's voice, only that her hand had slipped from his before the men with whips took him. He was not Roman. He never would be, but he was perfect, and in Rome, perfection was dangerous. The domus where he was trained was hidden behind the Palatine Hill, owned by a wealthy noble who specialized in refined acquisitions. Boys like Mikan were taught more than manners. They were polished like statues, how to bow, how to stand, how to speak in riddles and riddled smiles, how to endure. Older boys disappeared. New ones arrived. Mikan learned early not to ask where they went. The silence was part of the grooming. At 13, he was chosen to serve at private dinners. His job? To pour wine, to fetch grapes, to exist. But existence came at a cost. One night, during a banquet for high-ranking officials, the mood was dark and thick with tension. Nero had ordered a lavish performance. Gladiators reenacting the fall of Troy. Blood splattered the marble. Peacocks roasted whole. Musicians trembled under Nero's gaze, which grew sharper with every gulp of wine. Then the emperor arrived late, drunk, laughing, wrapped in violet silk that dragged on the floor behind him like a forgotten god. And that night, for the first time, he noticed Mikan. Noticed how still he stood, how quiet, how poised. Nero leaned into Tigellinus, his commander, and whispered, "Who's that statue come to life?" Tigellinus replied, "A new slave, my lord, from the east." Nero smiled. "Then let's test his loyalty." Mikan was brought to Nero's private quarters after midnight. He was told to kneel, to undress, to obey. But as the emperor stepped forward, touching his cheek with mock affection, something happened that should never happen to a slave in Rome. Mikan froze. He whispered, "No," a word so soft, it should have vanished in the air. But in the silence of that moment, it hit like thunder. Nero blinked. The room seemed to tilt. His smile broke. "No?" the emperor repeated, as if tasting the word on his tongue. "Did I hear a ghost or a defiance?" Mikan didn't repeat it. He simply bowed his head, eyes closed. It was over. Or, it had just begun. Mikan was taken without a word. 2 Praetorian guards appeared as if conjured from the darkness. One gripped his arm so hard he thought the bone might snap. The other pulled a heavy bronze chain from his belt, wrapped it around Mikan's wrists, and dragged him down the corridor. Past statues that had seen too much, and marble floors still damp from spilled wine and blood. He didn't cry. Not yet. He had said no to Nero, and Rome had no place for boys who refused gods. They brought him to a small stone room beneath the palace. It was colder than he imagined. The air smelled of damp earth and rusted iron. Chains clinked softly from the walls. This wasn't a prison. This was a room for silence. A room for those who were never meant to speak again. Tigellinus was already waiting. He stood with his arms crossed, wearing the polished armor of a man who'd buried every emotion he ever had. He looked at Mikan the way a man might look at a broken instrument, useless but expensive. "You embarrassed the emperor," Tigellinus said quietly, almost like a teacher. "You spat on a divine gift." Mikan didn't respond, so the first slap came hard and sudden, from behind. He tasted iron and fell to his knees. "I saw fear in your eyes," Tigellinus murmured, kneeling beside him. "But you should have feared differently. Now, you belong to another kind of Rome." He turned and left, and the door slammed shut. Hours passed, maybe days. Time dissolved in the dark. They didn't whip him, not yet. The punishment wasn't pain. It was removal. They removed his food, his sleep, his name. When the door opened again, it wasn't Nero. It was an old man named Silenus, a servant of punishments. He didn't speak. He simply poured cold water over Mikken's head and scrubbed him with rough salt and rags, like cleaning a trophy that had lost its shine. Then he cut Mikken's hair, not with care, with shears like cutting meat. "You are no longer beautiful," Silenus said. "You are now correct." When Nero finally returned, he came alone. The emperor stepped in slowly, his sandals echoing. His expression was unreadable, but his voice was soft, almost sweet. "You reminded me of someone," Nero said, kneeling in front of Mikken. "Of Sporus, of the boy I married." He didn't say no. Mikken, trembling, didn't move. "I gave him everything," Nero continued. "Jewels, palaces, the name of an empress." He touched Mikken's cheek again, but this time the touch was colder. "And yet you, a thing with no name, dared to look me in the eyes and refuse." Mikken expected pain, but instead, Nero whispered something that chilled his bones more than any chain. "You will live," he said, "because I want you to remember every second." From that night on, Mikken was assigned to the lowest ranks of the imperial household. He was stripped of his silks, his duties, and his voice. He was no longer invited to pour wine or dance. He was invisible, but invisibility had its own kind of power, because it let him watch, and Mikken began to see things others missed. Secret alliances, cruel games, trembling slaves too afraid to breathe. He also saw something else. Nero was cracking. The emperor who laughed like a god now muttered to shadows. He screamed at statues. He composed songs about betrayal and death, and performed them alone in empty rooms. Mikken wasn't just forgotten. He had become a ghost in Nero's palace. And ghosts sometimes learn how to haunt. Mikken learned to walk without sound. He moved through the palace like mist, sweeping floors that didn't need cleaning, collecting discarded goblets, emptying oil lamps in rooms that hadn't seen guests in days. But his eyes missed nothing. He saw how Rome was rotting. The guards had stopped saluting. The senators whispered in corners. Even the birds on Palatine Hill sang quieter, as if mourning a city that had already begun to collapse from within. And Nero was unraveling. He no longer appeared in armor or purple robes. He wore silk gowns now, trailing long behind him like fading dignity. Sometimes, Mikken would glimpse him in the early hours, wandering the halls barefoot, singing to marble busts as if they were his lost lovers. One night, Mikken watched him weep in front of a statue of Agrippina, the mother he had murdered. His sobs were not human. They were the cries of a soul that knew it was already damned. And Mikken felt nothing, not pity, not fear, only distance. But not everyone had forgotten Mikken. One morning, while sweeping the steps to the imperial bathhouse, he heard a voice call from the shadows. "You were the boy who said no." He turned. A young man stepped forward, no older than 18, with sharp green eyes and hair like polished bronze. He wore the dark blue cloak of a page, but his confidence betrayed a noble's blood. "My name is Elias," the boy said. "I serve Lucan, Nero's cousin, a poet, a conspirator." Elias leaned close. "There are many in Rome who are tired of the emperor's games. Some want witnesses, survivors, proof." Mikken blinked. He didn't speak. "You saw him," Elias whispered. "Truly saw him. That makes you dangerous. But it also makes you useful." He handed Mikken a scroll, sealed with wax. "No name. When the time comes," Elias said, "deliver this to me. You'll know when." Then he disappeared down the hall. That night, Mikken didn't sleep. The scroll burned against his skin like a brand. He had never held anything so dangerous. A whisper from a senator could be dismissed. But a slave boy with a secret? That was a death sentence. Still, he didn't burn it. He hid it beneath a loose stone behind the baths, the place where once, long ago, he had been scrubbed clean before Nero's summons. Felt like years ago. Felt like another life. The palace grew darker each day. Not just in spirit, in light. Torches weren't replaced. Tapestries hung torn. The laughter was gone, replaced with muttering, prayers, and footsteps that quickened at every corner. Then came the night of the fire. Not the fire, not the one that would later engulf the city and blame the Christians, but a smaller one inside the palace. A servant had spilled oil. The flame reached a curtain. Panic spread. Micken was in the upper corridor when it happened. As smoke filled the hallway, he didn't run. He went straight for the hidden stone, pulled the scroll, held it tight. Then he ran. Not away, but toward the Senate quarter, toward Elias, toward the ones who wanted Rome back. The streets of Rome were still wet from the night rains as Micken ran. He clutched the scroll like a dying heart, slipping through alleys, past bakers yawning at their ovens, past guards too drunk or too tired to care. He had no shoes, only ash-covered feet that burned with every step. But still he ran, because for the first time in his life he was carrying something that mattered. Not wine, not silks, not pleasure. Truth. The house of Lucan stood behind a veil of vines and polished marble. Micken reached the gates breathless, eyes darting. A cloaked man stood watch. "I need to see Elias," Micken gasped. I have what he asked for." The man didn't answer. He simply opened the door. Inside, the air smelled of ink and parchment and power. A senator's world. Poet's den. But under it all, the stench of fear clung like a second skin. Elias was waiting near the courtyard fountain, where blue light shimmered off the water's surface. He didn't smile when he saw Micken. "You made it," he said softly, eyes sharp. "Good." Micken handed him the scroll. Elias broke the seal, unfurled the message. "Read," and for a long moment said nothing. Then, "This changes everything." That night, Lucan himself summoned Micken. He was younger than Micken expected, not much older than Nero, but with eyes that held storms instead of flames. "You are brave," Lucan said, pacing before him, "but bravery alone won't save you." Micken didn't respond. "You understand what this means, don't you?" Lucan said, lifting the scroll. "This is the Emperor's madness, his crimes, his indulgences from someone who was there. Not a rumor, not a rival, but a child who survived it." "I didn't survive," Micken whispered. "Not all of me." Lucan's face darkened. "Then help us destroy the part that tried to kill you." In the days that followed, Micken was kept in a hidden villa just outside the city. Guards were posted. He was fed, clothed, even given olive oil for his wounds. But he wasn't free. He was a witness. And witnesses in Rome were tools. One evening, while sitting beneath an olive tree, Elias brought him a scroll. "Your testimony," Elias said, "written as poetry." Lucan's idea. Easier to hide, safer to spread. Micken read the first line aloud. "There was once a boy who said no to a god, and was made a ghost for it." He looked up. "Do they believe this will matter?" Elias nodded. "Words can shake thrones. But can they kill emperors?" Elias didn't answer. Rumors began to leak through the city. That Nero had married a eunuch. That he had watched children burn. That he had forced senators to dance in women's gowns while boys were whipped behind velvet curtains. Micken knew what was true. He had seen the eyes of men who believed they owned the world, and the bones of boys who were crushed by that belief. And yet, Rome hesitated, because to betray an emperor was to invite chaos. And Rome loved its chaos just as much as it feared it. One night, Elias returned with blood on his cloak. "It started," he whispered. "What has?" Micken asked. Elias looked him in the eyes. "The end of Nero. The night Nero fled Rome, the city did not weep. There were no parades, no torches lit in his honor, only silence, as if Rome itself was holding its breath, afraid to believe the monster was truly gone." In a damp chamber beneath the villa, Micken sat in stillness, listening to the distant sounds of sandals running over marble, messengers, soldiers, voices calling for loyalty and vengeance in the same breath. Then came Elias. "It's over," he said, eyes hollow. Micken stood. "Dead." A slow nod. He fled like a coward, took his own life. Lucan is gone, too. Executed weeks ago. Mikan didn't speak. His heart beat steady. Not with joy, not with grief, but with something colder. Release. Nero was dead. But not the world that made him. The scrolls that carried Mikan's story had already spread. From the shadows of temples, from under wine-soaked tables, slaves whispered it to each other like a psalm. The boy who refused the emperor. The one who walked away and lived. The one who remembered. And slowly the name Mikan became something more. Not a slave. A symbol. He was offered freedom. A house. Gold. Even citizenship. A gift few slaves ever dreamed of. But Mikan refused most of it. He took a small farm in the hills outside Antium. A quiet piece of land where the wind smelled of salt and the nights were long and full of stars. And for the first time he slept without waking in terror. But he did not forget. Each morning he wrote, pages and pages. Not just about Nero, but about the world behind the marble, about the boys, the shadows, the games no one dared speak of. He wrote for the ones who couldn't. For the boy with the green eyes who had bled out behind a curtain. For the child who had cried into silk pillows as senators laughed. For the nameless ghosts who still haunted the palace halls. Years later, a scholar from Hispania arrived at Mikan's door. He had read the poems, the ones Lucan had hidden, the ones that had survived fire and censorship and fear. You were the boy, the scholar said. You are the truth. Mikan didn't deny it. He simply handed the man a bundle of new scrolls. Take them, he said. Let the empire remember. The scholar bowed. Your story will outlive emperors. Mikan looked to the hills. Let it outlive monsters. He died quietly, under the same olive tree where Elias had once handed him a poem. No fanfare, no tomb, only a stone, carved by hand, that read, Mikan. He remembered, and in that memory, Rome's shame remained eternal, not for vengeance, but for warning. Some names are lost in history, erased by time or power, but sometimes a single act of refusal survives across centuries. If the story moved you, share it. Not just for Mikan, but for every voice that was once silenced, and now can finally be heard.